Let's shift the paradigm to prioritize our peace and focus on the positive while creating balance to make living our best life the ultimate goal. We'll talk boundaries, self-care, mental health, and overcoming obstacles. You'll hear interviews and fresh perspectives to support you along the way. Let's elevate the conversation and level up our self-growth game. This is the Piece of Me podcast. If you're listening to this episode, maybe you too feel like you're close to burning out. Maybe you feel like you're ready to snap. That was me just a few weeks ago. My personal life, my professional life, and everything in between was pulling me in different directions. Something had to give. And with all the things that were happening, I was learning that the only thing that was going to give was me. Hi friends, I'm Lexy Lee. If you're new here, welcome. And if you're not, then welcome back. Spring is in the air, the days are staying lighter longer, and hopefully you're feeling a sense of excitement as we shift into a new season. Or maybe you need some support trying to find your own balance and not burn out in the process. And if so, I totally hear you and I've got you. My guest today is someone so relatable. She's a mom, a wife, and a burnout survivor turned author. She supports those who battle overwhelm with systems and self-care. From a successful, high-level career in the corporate world to now working out of her home office filled with sunshine, my guest LaVista Jones is all about the shift, a boss shift. When LaVista and I were first emailing just to set up our recording session, I remember one of her out-of-office messages that said she had traded in her keyboard for fuzzy socks and her desk chair for her favorite cozy blanket. Not something you ever see, right? But I loved it. Her out-of-office message was all about self-care. And there are phrases in today's world that make us think overworking and overperforming or overfunctioning is like a badge of honor, like I'll sleep when I'm dead, or taking on so much because you feel you can't push back or even say no. But if you're always tired, are you close to burning out? Are you uninspired? Or is this just the way it's supposed to be when you're adulting and getting things done? Is this the norm if you have kids, a career, or maybe even if you're type A? Now, I was really surprised to learn about how LaVista got her own point of burnout, and it wasn't the situation that I was expecting. Our conversation reflected on more connected self-care, prioritizing our own needs, mental health, and checking in with ourselves. And it's no surprise that I absolutely love this conversation with her, and I think you'll love it too. So let's take a listen. LaVista, welcome to the Piece of Me podcast.
Hey, Lexy, it's so great to be here. Thank you for having me as your guest.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And I'm so excited for everybody to learn more about your book and kind of understand why you wrote it. But before we get into that, why don't you just tell us about yourself first?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I'm an author, also a speaker and a coach, and I also happen to be the CEO of a podcasting agency. And some might be like, well, how do any of those things go together? But the main bridge is specifically helping women to do work that they love without burning themselves out and without sacrificing themselves and their health to do it. So through the coaching, the speaking, the writing that I do, that's the message. And then also with the clients that we have with the podcasting agency, it's doing your podcast and producing it in a way with support and a team that you're able to share your message and amplify your message without you burning yourself out doing it.
I love that. And I think so many listeners are going to take a lot away from the conversation today. So I'm excited. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Even as I just think about, conversations with girlfriends, like this is a hot topic. And I think, as people move into the new year, especially it's, if you do want to live your best life, you want to take care of yourself, these are conversations and tips everyone can benefit from. So let's talk about how you call yourself a burnout survivor. So, and you also say that you're a recovering overfunctioner. So what was your own breaking point with that?
Yeah, burnout survivor. So I always joke that I experienced burnout in my former life. So I'm a corporate dropout. I was an AVP at major financial institution here in the States. And I had such terrible boundaries around like my own time that everything was prioritized around work. I would work 15, 16-hour days, no problem. Sometimes I would work throughout the night, no problem. It was like work, work, work. All that was the priority, not my health, not eating, not resting. Even being newly married at the time when I first started my career, I would be away from my husband for a week at a time, come home, see him maybe on the weekends. And then it was like right back on a plane across the country. So, going through all these different time zones, not eating, not sleeping, working through the night. And that was a pace that I kept up literally for years until my body was just like, we're not going to do this anymore. And so the breaking point was literally me having what I now know is an anxiety attack on the highway going into the office, but I had no idea what was going on with me. I just knew that like my palms started sweating and my heart started racing and I'm crying and I'm just like having like this moment. And I got to the office and I thought I was like losing my mind. So I remember calling home and calling my husband. I'm like, so I think I'm going crazy. I am coming home. And I remember the next phone call I made was to a psychologist because it was like, somebody needs to see me today because I think I'm losing my mind. And so going through that process, I always talk about it. It's complicated, like a relationship status, because the job itself, I loved my job. I loved everything about it. And actually the position that I had was created literally just for me. So I truly loved the work that I was doing, but not taking care of myself, not prioritizing myself was literally killing me. And so going through that, was a big, an important lesson for me to learn that, something's got to shift with the way that I am like living life and integrating work into it, because work can't be the most important thing. And, I often say in my work that in order to really fulfill your vision, you have to take care of the visionary, and that's you. So, I can't show up for work. I can't show up to be a good wife. I can't show up to be a good mom if I'm not okay first. And so I think that was like the biggest lesson that I took away from that. And then seeing, so many other women in the marketplace corporately and on the entrepreneurial world doing the same thing and those same habits, I was like, oh, I've got to like sound the alarm and say, hey, stop. Like, we don't have to keep working this way, because our health and our, mental, health and stability, like, it's not worth that sacrifice.
I agree. And I'm so glad these conversations are being just more openly talked about, because I feel like in the past it was kind of like shunned if you wanted to talk about this stuff. Like mental health wasn't really, and we talked so much about mental health on this podcast. So you had said how you have this you were going through this like a panic attack. You didn't even know that's what was happening at the time. You call your husband, you're like, the next phone call has to be to a therapist or whatnot. And let me ask you this, did this happen before the pandemic? I'm just curious, or did this happen?
It did. My episode happened before the pandemic. It was 2014, actually. So well before the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah. And I only asked that because I know, it seems like a lot of people have been reevaluating their lives, since the pandemic, because, it's really forced people to look at their lives and evaluate. So, all right. So let's talk about this book. So your book is called The Boss Shift, and I will link all the notes and where you can buy it in the episode description. So what made you decide to write it, other than obviously your personal experience? But I guess what can they expect from your book?
Yeah, so BOSS in the title, it's an acronym for Battling Overwhelm with Systems and Self-Care. So that's the approach that I take to, I guess you would say, like work-life integration. And the thing that caused me to actually write the book was I was at a friend's funeral, and she was an entrepreneur. She also had a 9-to-5, a traditional 9-to-5 job as well. And she was the type that would always put others first before herself, right? So it didn't matter if she was tired, didn't matter if she wasn't feeling well. And so I feel like that was, a downfall for her, but those around her as well, I feel like took advantage of that. So they always asked for more, always needed her to do more, always wanted her, to be more. And it didn't really matter what her physical or mental state was at the time. It was like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And I remember sitting at that funeral, And there's a time when, friends and family can get up and say, their regards or whatever. And it was person after person after person kept getting up and saying, she was so selfless and she always put everybody's needs before her own. And while I understood the sentiment, it pissed me off because it was just like, you know what? That's part of the reason that she's here. And so to back up, my friend, she was away on a trip trying to take care of herself, taking a little bit of rest, but a client needed something from her. So she decided to drive from Vegas back to Phoenix, where we both live, but she wasn't feeling well. And instead of kind of listening to her own body and going to maybe go to the urgent care or like, hey, somebody should check me out because things aren't going well, on that drive home, she had a stroke.
Oh.
And she had a stroke really in the middle of nowhere, right? Because between Vegas and Phoenix is just desert. So it took a long time for a medical team to get to her. And over the next 18 months after that first stroke, she had 3 additional strokes. And that first one left her paralyzed on one side of her body, unable to speak. And, like I said, she had 3 additional, and, those eventually led to her death. And so it was sitting there listening to all these very well-meaning individuals talk about how my friend put everybody else before herself. I was like, yeah, that's not eulogy goals in my mind, because I feel like that is the quintessential problem that we don't prioritize ourselves. We don't make room for ourselves. We don't, do the things that we need to do to make sure we are okay, because we're always so busy doing for others, taking care of others, saying yes to others, prioritizing other people. And so my editor happened to be at that same funeral. And I remember talking to her afterwards, and I said, so it's time to write, because I'm sick of this. I can't sit by anymore and literally watch women work themselves to death.
Let me ask this too. What age was she when this all happened to her?
She was in her late 50s. So, I feel like she had a lot of life left in front of her. I feel like some of that could have been prevented, right? By her being able to have, give herself permission to kind of take care of herself first. Like, sure, I can probably get to that, but I need to make sure I'm okay first. And I think that we as women in general have a really hard time saying that. And it's not okay.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
And which is another question I was going to ask you too is, and I think that's the, not to go in like gender role direction, but like, we're naturally caregivers. We tend to, some of us are definitely people pleasers, and we're trying to undo some of that wiring. But why is it that women are we want to help everybody, want to take care of people. We want to put others first. Like, why is that?
Well, I think that socially we're conditioned that that's how we show our value as women, right? Like, so if I'm not doing all of the things, somehow I'm not showing I'm valuable. If I'm not killing myself at work, I'm not showing my value. If I'm not hustling day in and day out, I'm not showing my value as an entrepreneur. We talk about like the mental load that like mothers and spouses like carry, like all the stuff that's just always in their head, like thinking about this and thinking about that. We're conditioned to like, okay, if I'm not doing this, if I'm not doing that, if I'm not taking control of this and making sure that this gets done, it's not going to get done. That over functioning, that I talk about in the book, where we're conditioned that if we're not doing that, we have no value that we bring to the table. And it's really unfortunate.
Yeah. And that's such a great point, because it's almost like, when you hear the term mom, like you expect them to be tired, you expect them to do all the things. It's just right. Like, they go hand in hand, and it's like, why? And even as, like you said, an entrepreneur or whatever it is, it's like, why? And I heard somebody say recently that way back in the day, maybe this is the 40s or the 50s, that a lot of times the reason that women stayed home was because it allowed the husband, because you do have stuff at home that has to get done, like laundry and cooking and cleaning. And it allowed the men in their lives to have these careers and be the breadwinner, because the woman took care of the home. Because otherwise, when you do have 2 people working, right, there's so much to do. There's so much stuff that has to get done. And it's like, and a lot of times women put it on their shoulders and try to get it all done. So
sometimes voluntarily, right?
Absolutely.
There's a quote that I have in the book, and I forget who said it, but it's that women are expected to work like they don't have children, to raise children like they don't have to work and to look physically like they don't do either.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, okay, where'd this come from? Like, where'd this expectation come from? But you're right,
Yeah, good
right? Like,
point.
I mean, stuff has to get done, but I think that we kind of tend to take it all on our shoulders and not ask for help when we really desperately need it, or take that rest when we need it. Again, I think it comes back to being conditioned to show our value.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great point. That really is. So let's talk a little bit about, you just kind of mentioned like self-care and really, really knowing when we need to take a break, which is very hard. So in talking about practicing self-care, you did mention though that you could do more damage than good. So can you
Mm.
kind of elaborate on what that means?
Yeah, so self-care is so personal, Lexi, right? You know, what's going to work for me is not necessarily going to work for you. What works for you is not necessarily going to work, for the majority of your listeners. So, one, I think that you have to understand and like reconnect with who you are and understand what kind of self-care you need, what needs to be in your kind of self-care toolkit, if you will. And when I talk about self-care potentially doing more harm, it's when we're doing it the way that quote unquote they say that we should do it. I had a friend that I was doing some self-care coaching with, and when we began coaching, she was like, I don't really understand why I'm always still so stressed out. She's like, I'm doing all of the self-care things, but I still feel a certain kind of way. And I'm like, well, explain like what your self-care is. And she's like, well, I'm getting a massage every 3 weeks, and I'm getting a pedicure like every other week. And, she was doing this other stuff. And I'm like, well, all right. We kind of looked at like her love languages, and we realized that like physical touch was like a 2 for her. And I'm like, so if
Ah.
it's so low for you, why are you doing massages? She was like, because that's what they say self-care is. And I'm like, for people who like being touched, like you don't like being touched. And so we found out after talking about it more that every time she went and got this massage that they said that she should have, she felt more tense because the thought in the act of a stranger touching her body tensed her up and stressed her out. So the massage had the complete opposite effect on her. It didn't relax her. It didn't take her to this nice Zen kind of like mindset. It made her miserable. And I'm like, so can we agree that you can stop doing these? Like, massages are not your thing. And
No.
so kind of helping her rediscover what kind of did it for her, really looking at her love languages and making sure that she was becoming fluent in speaking her love language back to herself. We discovered that she wanted to paint. Right. So she went and she
Oh.
treated herself to easels and new paint and new brushes, and she would make these painting dates with her. That gave her so much more fulfillment and filled up like her love buckets way more than a massage ever would. And so that's why I say that sometimes doing self-care can cause more harm than good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great point. And how interesting because, you would think, oh, getting these massages and having almost like this scheduled self-care, like this should feel good. But it was interesting that she's feeling like, no, this isn't doing what I thought it would do. And then there you are kind of figuring out why. Like how
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. So, and I was going to ask you kind of what self-care looks like for you, but you brought up such a good point that should people kind of look at their love language as a place to start to even figure out?
Oh, 1,000%, right? Because I think that when we think of like the concept of love languages, we usually do it in the context of like a romantic partnership with somebody else. Like,
Mm-hmm.
let me know how to speak their love language so that, our relationship can grow. And we forget that we should be fluent in our own love languages, right? Like, if you love flowers, you don't have to wait for your partner to buy you flowers. Buy yourself the flowers and have that spark of
Mm-hmm.
joy and happiness, right? If, so like that's just a very simple example. So I think that if you're kind of stuck on, what self-care could or should be, for you, that's a great place to start, because very often I feel like we don't really know what our core love languages are, how we actually receive love. And then like once we kind of dig into that and we can kind of use that as like a foundation, we can start doing things in our everyday lives that speak that language to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah.
That's such a good point because I was actually talking on a previous episode that, even with self-care, sometimes we just think it's like the maintenance that we do just to keep up who we are, like
Mm-hmm.
if you are going to get your nails done, like that's great. But if that's what you do anyway, that might not be so fulfilling. But I love how you're saying, really dig deep and figure out what kind of makes you tick on this. And then that's the bucket. Like you said, if you like flowers, don't wait for the partner, just go get them yourself, because that's
Yep.
going to make you just feel like so good. I love it.
It's gonna make you happy. It's like and to me, that's what self-care is. It's the things that you do intentionally that bring
Hmm.
you those moments of joy. So they don't have to be these elaborate, 7-day trips to like Rome, which if it is, do that. But I
Hmm.
know the way that my bank account is set up, I can't go to Rome every day or every week,
Yep.
right? Like I've got to
Hmm.
do the small stuff like at home that I can do and execute every day and actually just ingrate it in part of my life. And it's like, that's the stuff that makes me happy. That's the stuff that brings me joy. Those simple pleasures, right? Like finding the joy in the ordinary. And I
Hmm.
think that's the key to your self-care. And it's going to change and it's going
Hmm.
to evolve as you evolve, right? I'm 43. The things that bring me joy in at 43 as a wife and a mom are not the same things that brought me joy when I was 20 and
Yep.
single and childless, right? So
Hmm.
I've evolved as a person. Your self-care has to evolve in practice as well.
I couldn't agree more with that.
Yeah.
So, and you just said one thing too, that even, simple things, like in your daily routine, like, would you mind just sharing like a couple things that like maybe might be part of your self-care, just to kind of give some people like an idea of where to start or what to think about?
Yeah. So one that I share a lot is um, for my lunch that that I have on my schedule every day. I actually drink like my tea or my lemonade or whatever it is out of these really beautiful hand painted wine glasses that I got from a friend.
Ooh.
Because it's one of those things like you get it as a gift and you're like, ooh, like I'll use this for like my anniversary or I'll use this for my birthday. And it's like, well, why can't every day be special, right? Like if I'm just
Hmm.
downstairs even just eating a turkey sandwich with some chips and lemonade, it's just like, well, if I put this lemonade in this really beautiful glass, that's going to make me happy. And so then
Yep.
it's like, okay, I'm looking forward to like my lunch in this glass. And, sometimes I'll bring the glass back up to my office. I'll have a call and, I'll have to let the client know, like, I'm not day drinking. This is just my juice for lunch, but it's made me happy.
I
It's
love
made me
that.
happy. Yeah.
Yeah, I could see
Yeah.
that. What that's because to your point, yeah, that's something that a beautiful gift, or we all do that. I mean, I feel like the nice clothes or the everyday clothes or the nice jewelry or the everyday jewelry, like there's so much dishware, whatever it might be, that we
Mm,
save it for a special occasion, and it's like, why? What are we waiting for?
right. Like you woke up today. Isn't that special enough?
Yep.
It should be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but like I said, like that's just one of those things like that is unique to me, that I like to do for myself. One of the other things that I do that's a pretty simple thing is like I'm a words of affirmation person. And so you can see my office a little bit, Lexy, right, in the, the video that we have. But I
Mm-hmm.
have words up all over my office so that I can see these affirming things, when I come in here and I come to work. I also keep a dry erase board pen in my bathroom. And it's kind of like a being Mary Jane scene in there, right? Where it's like I've got messages and things to myself for if I've read something and, a quote really resonates with me, I'll write that on my mirror so that,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sitting there brushing my teeth or doing my hair. And it's like I'm reading those things that like make me feel good, that speak to my soul. And again, that's just another very simplistic, everyday kind of a thing that I can do that literally costs me nothing, but it's
Mm-hmm.
something that really just kind of speaks to the essence of who I am, and I get to do it. It's like part of my life. It's like second nature that like, oh, these words make me feel good. Let me put them someplace so I can see them.
That's a great idea, because you're keeping it in the forefront, because otherwise, yeah, I mean, even if you read something and you put the book down, you kind of forget what you just read,
Yeah.
whatever it might be. And I like that that's it. And, it's, I know nobody can see what your office here looks like, but
I know.
she's got in different colors on the mirror behind her, all kinds of stuff. I can't read it, but I think that's so cool. I love that.
Yeah.
I think it's a great idea. Oh my gosh. So let's go, let's talk about, we were just talking about like women and just how, you know, maybe the reason that they take on so much is because they feel like it shows their value. So it is hard to say no. But, let's talk about women who maybe are overworked or they are afraid to say no. There maybe might, could hurt their relationship, could hurt their career. So how can women push back and not be and not be afraid to say no if that's really what they need to do?
Yeah. One thing I would suggest, right, is it's an exercise that I take clients through is visualizing what life will be like if they burn out. Right? If you keep this pace up, taking on all this stuff, not saying no, not really having or, setting or abiding by boundaries or whatever, what's life going to look like if you reach that limit and you burn out? What do you think that that's going to look like for you, for your family, your job, like whatever the case may be, and kind of give yourself some permission to kind of like think about what that could be. And 9 times out of the 10, you're going to want to avoid that at all costs, right? And so then it's just kind of like, okay, give yourself permission to ask for some help, I think would be like the number one thing I would come from that. Like I typically do like a ritual like on Sundays and I ask myself like a series of questions. One of them is like, how are you? But I give myself permission to actually like answer that question, like, beyond like I'm tired or, I'm anxious or whatever, but it's just like, why am I tired? Why am I feeling anxious? Why am I feeling overwhelmed? And I, kind of journal and get that stuff out. And then I ask myself, what do I need? And sometimes I need to ask my husband to take on dinner on Thursday. Right. And it not necessarily like this like super big thing, but it's like, that one thing when I'm looking at like the week ahead, I can't figure out how I'm going to be able to get the kid to school, do the stuff that I need to do, work with the client, do this, and like have dinner on the table. I need your help with this, right? And, he has zero issue stepping in and doing that. And so, yeah, I would visualize what is burnout actually going to look like for you if you continue at this pace, and then give yourself permission to kind of ask yourself those questions and do what I call like a check-in. Ask yourself how you're doing, and then ask yourself what you need. And then if that is support from a spouse, from a coworker, from, a mastermind, from a friend, whatever, ask them for it. Because I think that that's like probably one of our biggest hindrances as women. We don't raise our hand and say, hey, I need some help with this, because it goes back to that whole value thing. And to raise our hand, it's like, oh, you're showing a weakness or a vulnerability. You're showing you're human. And you're allowed to take your super cape off. It's fine. And the world will continue to spin. I promise it will. Raise your hand and say that you need some help, because you've already pictured what it will look like if you don't.
Yeah, very good point. So to take that like a step further, so let's just say her employer says, hey, I need you to take on this project, or I need you to travel this weekend. And maybe she's got stuff going on with her kids, or it's just a project that maybe she just finished another project. And to your point, maybe she's like, if I do this other project, I'm going to burn myself right out. So what would that conversation sound like? Like, how would it sound like, let me get a coworker to help me with the project? Or how do you kind of delicately push back then?
Yeah, I think you've got to, like in situations like that, you've got to count the cost, right? Like, saying yes to something, we're saying no to something else. So if we're saying yes to that extra project, we're saying no to some extra time that we might have had in our schedule. We might be saying no to doing something with a spouse. We might be saying no to doing something with a kid. And we've got to count the costs and see, like, is it worth it, right? Is it worth it to me to miss out on doing this in order to get this thing done? And if it is, then I think that, hey, women are miracle workers and we find the capacity to dig deep and we do it. If it's not worth it, then that's where I think like the conversation needs to happen, right? Like going to a boss and saying, hey, this is what I've got on my plate. This is this new thing that you're asking me to do. And then just see, like, are there flexible turnaround times? Like, okay, I can probably do this, but getting it done by Friday is probably not realistic for me. Is it okay if we push this back to like next Wednesday? Right. And just have like those conversations, right? Like I think about my time in corporate. my boss was just as busy, if not busier than I was, right? And so he's not really tracking all of the stuff that he's like asked me to do. It's just something came across his desk, he pushes it out to me, and it's like, hey, I need you to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then I think it's, up to us that it's just like, okay, like I'm juggling all these things. Let me have a conversation with my superior, my higher ups, or, whatever. And it's like, okay, all of this stuff is doable, but all the stuff is not doable right now. Like, can you help me prioritize? Or this is what I've decided that I think is a good priority list. Like, can you sign off on this or whatever the case may be? And I know sometimes you're going to get a boss that's going to be a little rigid and not really be willing to have those conversations. But I think that you owe it to yourself to at least try, especially if you've never tried before, to like help yourself have some flexible turnaround times, deadlines, those kind of things, and just talk about capacity and like where you are. And I think that those that you're working with or that, that are your higher ups will probably try to lean towards being more reasonable than being, a hard ass and saying, no, this has got to be done by midnight or your chariot's going to turn into a pumpkin. I don't know.
I like that. Yeah. But you just made so many good points. Like, I love the thought process of count the cost. Think of it like, if you do miss the game or you do miss the event with your child, what's that going to cost? What effect does that have on your child and the memory and the experience? If you do accommodate the boss or you don't, it's like, think of it either way, kind of play it out in your head. And I think that's such a great way to think about that. And I also love how you said all the stuff is doable, but it might not be doable right now. And just to try. I mean, like to your point, if you haven't ever pushed back on the boss or whoever it is that's asking a lot of you, why not just try and see what comes of it? And I think that that's such great advice. And so how do people even know if they're getting close to the point of burnout? Like, what are some signs of, hey, you know what? It's coming. I mean, like, for example, I mean, you loved your job. Like, that was really interesting to hear you say, I loved my job, but yet here you were. Yeah. I mean, so people may think, oh, if I hate my job, then I know. Like, so what should they look for?
Yeah. So one, if you are having problems concentrating on what it is that you're needing to focus on, and like it's a consistent thing where it's like you kind of always feel like you're in this fog, that would definitely be a warning sign. Looking at your energy, if your energy has shifted significantly where you just feel exhausted all of the time, and you're actually getting some decent rest, you're eating fairly well, so you don't really understand like why you feel this way, that would be a sign for you as well. If you have like a lack of joy or I guess joy or contentment with the work that you're doing, like you're just kind of like like you are kind of indifferent to what it is that you're doing, like nothing kind of like sparks on the inside of you, you're not really enjoying it, that could potentially be a sign as well. And then really pay attention to any kind of physical stuff that is going on with you. So before I went into a full-blown panic attack in the middle of the 202, my body was whispering to me that whole time, where it's just like, I would have a headache that wouldn't go away for a really long time. But it's just like, what? I've got stuff to do. I've got my Tylenol. I've got some coffee. Maybe there's just a caffeine headache. And I kept pushing through it. My body was exhausted. I talk about being, in California, like on a Monday, and then I'm in North Carolina on Wednesday, right? Like I'm going across the country constantly. And it's just like, oh, I'm tired, but it's fine. But it's like, I'm not giving myself like a chance to rest. And so it's like my body, like I said, was whispering all along. It took 7 years for me to get to that place where like my body was finally like, no, we're not doing this anymore. So it wasn't like a couple of months went by and it was like, oh, like I've burnt out. Years on top of years on top of years of working at an unsustainable pace. And so your body is going to tell you, it's going to start giving you signs. Don't ignore them. I didn't really want to acknowledge that I was working too much. I even had a colleague once that like pulled me aside and was like, man, like, your quality of life, like, are you okay? And I'm like, I'm great. Like, I was moving up the corporate ladder. I, had ambitions that I was trying to go for. And it's like, I rest, like, I'll rest later, right? Like I'll rest once
Mm-hmm.
I got my letters and I've got my promotion and I've got like my like whatever. And it's like those things happen, those milestones came, but the rest didn't because it wasn't part of my practice.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, your body will tell you, there will be signs. And if you're feeling that way, any of those things, like I would say you're probably a lot closer to
Mm-hmm.
potentially that burnout phase than you might even care to admit.
So let me ask you this, and this is something I didn't even plan on thinking of asking you until you just said all that. So when you
Yeah.
finally did decide to leave this job that you were obviously very successful at and you loved it, so I'm sure leaving it was probably never on the radar, but when you finally did to say, decide, okay, my body is telling me one thing, it's time to leave. Did they try to make you stay, or maybe they did, but how, like, to actually finally say, you know what, I have to walk away from this. Like, yes, I am successful, but I have to walk away. Was it hard for you to do? Was it easy to do? Like, how kind of was that process for you? And were you relieved after?
It was hard for me to do because a lot of my identity in that season of my life was tied to that job. So it was a very difficult thing to walk away from. And I can remember the conversation that my husband and I had over dinner when it became very clear to both of us that I needed to resign. I remember just crying and crying and crying because it was just like, well, if I don't do this, what am I going to do? And I think it
Mm,
all circles back to that whole value thing, right? If I'm not doing this,
yep.
what value do I bring to the table? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, part of your earlier question too was, um, did they try to like, make me stay or, whatever? And it's interesting, those conversations happened after I resigned, right? So it's
Oh,
like,
wow.
hey, kind of having those conversations, like, my psychologist that, I called that day that I thought that I was losing my mind. Um, the very first conversation I had with her in her office, she started filling out paperwork to put me on short-term disability because she was like,
Mm.
you're not okay and you need to be away from this office. And I'm like, what? Like it was like a
Wow.
clutch pearls kind of like, what do you mean? Like, but I love what I'm doing. How is this bad for me? And she's just like, woman, like you don't have the good sense to like take care of yourself, even though this is like right here, like, hitting
Oh,
you in the head with a 2x4 right at this point.
mm-hmm.
And she's like, no, you're stressed, you're overworked. She was like, you're burnt out. Like, this is why your body is reacting this way. And so I was out for 6 weeks. And so then it was like, coming back into the same environment, it was just like, well,
Mm.
okay, I need to try to have a different approach and, those kind of things. And it just wasn't conducive for my line of work. And, the job was the job. And it was just like, okay, I can't do this. I can't do this anymore.
Mm.
I can't do this way. But it was after that resignation actually came. It was like, well, we could talk about, from an HR perspective, we could talk about, flex days or doing this. And it's like, it's too late.
Mm.
Those were the conversations I needed that I was trying to have
Yep.
right before. And so now I kind of figure that out on my own, right? Now that I'm like the boss in charge of my schedule, I'll
Mm-hmm.
figure out what a reasonable work day looks like for me and, those kind of things. So yeah, but it was very hard for me to walk away.
Yeah, and I just think that's such a good point to make because, I don't think people would expect that if you love your job, you're going to feel the way that you do, but it can
No,
happen.
no. And that's why I say that it was like, I give it that title that it was complicated, right? Because
Mm.
you've seen those kind of statuses on like
Oh,
Facebook, like,
yeah.
oh, are you like taken or married? Like, it's complicated. Because I loved it. I loved
Yeah.
it. But I didn't have good boundaries. And I can remember one person asking me, like, is there anything that could have made you stay? And I
Mm.
remember telling her, I was like, it would have been seeing any of my higher ups model any kind of boundary at all, right?
Mm.
If my VP had left on Fridays at 5 because he had a non-negotiable that he was going to have dinner with his wife, I would have followed suit. If my VP or my SVP, if I hadn't gotten emails from them at 3 o'clock in the morning or when they're supposed to be on vacation, right? You're on vacation. You've been out of the office for a whole week, but you've been on your BlackBerry the whole time. I've heard from you the entire time you've been away. So who am I not to work the exact same way that I'm seeing you work? And I think that if I had seen any kind of boundary, around time, taking time for myself, like actually putting work down, I would have followed suit. But instead, I followed and I emulated what I saw. And what I saw was work, 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 do more with less, do the job of like 3 or 4 people, even though you're only one. And so it's just like, yeah. So we have to be okay with modeling that for ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Even when we don't see it.
And that does happen too. In some companies, I do hear where they are trying to push management to, you have to lead by example, because otherwise, especially as employees, it's so easy to feel, well, if my boss is doing it, they're going to expect it of me, and I've worked for employers who upper management. And I had one person I worked for who was a very lovely person, but she couldn't sleep at night. And so you would get emails at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning because she couldn't sleep. And she was good intentioned, but when your phone is dinging in the middle of the night because, your boss is emailing you something. I mean, it's just, how do you shut off? And how do you, to your point, how do you have a boundary between work life when you have, because then you feel like you can't push back, and that puts you in that almost like a toxic environment.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because one thing I have learned, working corporately and working for myself is that work fills up the time that you give it, right? So in those times when I was working throughout the night, like work was there with me lockstep. Every single moment that I wanted to give to work, it was like, okay, I'm here for it. Let's do it. Where now, where I get to kind of make up the rules, right? Like I have a work candle in my office, and I come in, kind of a ritual. I light it when work starts during, the first part of the day. And then when it's time for me to leave the office, I blow it out, right? To kind of signify that like my work is done. I'm leaving this office. I'm leaving the work behind. Like I'm now putting on like my mom hat or my spouse hat. And, it'll show up for me tomorrow when I come back into the office. Because if you give it 24 hours a day, it'll be there. If you limit the time that you focus on it, it will adhere to those time boundaries as well. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah. And there's always going to be more work that has to get done. And that's such a great point. I love that you have done something to, separate, and kind of, especially if you do work from home, if people, or if you can, if you have a flexibility of bringing your laptop home with you, or you, whatever it might be, it is. I mean, there's always going to be something that needs to get done. And where do you kind of create the separation, especially if your office is, however many feet from your bedroom? I mean, that's really tough.
Exactly.
That.
Yeah. And again, that's one of those very simple kind of things that it's just like, okay, like, I jokingly call it my work candle, but it's just a regular candle, but it signifies, it's like a physical thing, right? That's attached to my work. Like when it's lit, it's work time. When it's out, it's not. And I have found now that like I have been doing it for so long that when I have like these breaks, like with my son, being out on break from school or whatever the case may be, it is so hard for me to like bring myself back up to my office if it's not within that time frame that has been like designated as like my work time. It's just like, oh, I don't want to. I don't want to light my candle right now. It's out, right? So it's like, okay, it's that boundary. It's working, and it's like my team knows that like once my son gets out of school, I'm not working. I'm a mom. Like I wanted that position way more than I wanted a work position like my whole life. So I'm not going to sacrifice my time with him to come up and get on a call because I don't want to.
I love that. I love how you said that, because you're right. It's really creating boundaries, not only because we think boundaries so much in our relationships and our personal lives. We don't always think about boundaries in our work life. And that's such a great point. Yeah. And you want that position more. I love that. That's so great. That is so great. So obviously people are going to have to get their hands on your book, but when they do get your book, what are some of the key takeaways that you're hoping you want the readers to understand? What do you want them to walk away with?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, and it's the theme that goes really throughout, that you can do work that you love doing that deeply resonates with you without sacrificing yourself to do it, right? We don't have to listen to what hustle culture or society tells us, especially us as women. We can do what we want to do. We can make the impact that we want to make, but we don't have to sacrifice ourselves, our health, our relationship to do it. And it really kind of touches on starting with your mindset, right? That you're tired of busyness. You're tired of like the hustle. You're tired of kind of doing life and work the way that they say that you have to do it, that, you know, you really are in control of the way that you want to live your life when it comes to incorporating your work in, you know, living. And then really kind of figuring out what any kind of mindset blocks that you might have. You know, there are a few that I touch on in the book, like, you know, is pride getting in the way of you over functioning and doing all of these things, right? Is what I call boss shame, like, right? Like not knowing how to do X, Y, and Z. Is that like keeping you from like raising your hand and saying, hey, I need help with this or whatever the case may be. So it starts with like your mindset, and then it really kind of goes into how can you systematize your life more to just make life easier. Because I don't know, I think that somewhere along the line, like somebody has told us like life has got to be hard, and I'm just like, I call B and S on all of that, right? So, and you don't have to be a business owner to systematize your life. Like if you're a mother, you run on systems every single day, right? If you're waking up a kid in the morning, you have a routine that you take them through, from waking them up to doing all their bathroom stuff, washing their face, brushing their teeth, getting dressed, having breakfast, whatever the case may be, to getting them out of that door. That's a system. Because all a system is what are the steps that you do between point A and point B to get to that point B to get that thing done. So all of us use systems. Stay-at-home moms, entrepreneurs, if you're, you know, a corporate leader, we all use systems. So how do you systematize your life more to bring ease to the things that you need to get done, right? And then focusing on your self-care. And one, you know, reconnecting with yourself and understanding like what that self-care is for you. And then how do you incorporate it into your actual life? Because my philosophy is that self-care isn't something that should be like on a to-do list that you kind of check off. It's more of a way of life, but you have to understand what self-care is for you, like what you need to get out of it, how you want to feel because of it, and then how you can live your life that way, as opposed to it being this thing that like, oh, I self-cared today and I get to check that off. And it's like, no, I lived my life on my own terms and I feel fantastic.
Yep.
And so that all happens with making little bitty shifts in your mindset and shifts in how you actually execute things from day to day. And that really is essentially what the book is.
I love it. I love it. There's so many good things you've shared today in this conversation that, people are going to have to get your book, because I feel like there's just so much value in everything you just brought that, you know, we all can take something away. And I think we need like the permission to feel like everything you shared. It's like people probably feel some of these things are like, am I really allowed to say them? Am I really allowed to push back? Am I allowed to say no? And, you know, it's like just knowing like, yes, you can. It's, you know, and to your point, don't put your value in, you know, X, Y, or Z. There's more to that. So, Lavista, this has been wonderful. I think there's so much good stuff here, but how can people find you if they want to connect?
Well, on social media, I'm Lavista Jones, really everywhere, on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook. You can find me there. And you can go to the website is the same, lavistajones.com. And actually there, you can actually download even the first chapter of the book for free and just kind of read through it, which includes the manifesto that, you know, that is kind of like the core of the book itself.
Very cool. Very cool. That's awesome. And I'll link all of Lavista's social links down below. So if you're driving, you can just you can get that later on. And we're gonna have you back because this is really good stuff.
Oh, I would love it. I would love it. This was a great conversation. You asked such amazing questions. And this is what I love talking about, right?
Same.
I love, you know, trying to inspire women to just think about their lives a little bit differently. Like, who told you you had to do it that way? Yep. Maybe you're happy doing it that way. I don't know. But I have a sneaking suspicion maybe you're not, that you feel like maybe things could be a little bit different, and they can be. Yeah.
Yeah. I love it. Awesome. Awesome. Good stuff. Well, thank you so much for being here, and we'll have to talk to you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
To be part of the exclusive listener group, hit the follow button on whichever podcast platform you're listening to right now. When you follow, you'll be the first to know about new episodes so you can listen before anyone else. You'll also have quick access to the show, making it convenient to find for the next time. For more free content, join me on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and online at peaceofmepodcast.com.